Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your stack of source material, all those articles, research papers, even dry regulatory guides, and we filter it all down into crystal clear, actionable knowledge. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into what is, it's really the single most critical decision-making stage in the mortgage world, underwriting. And for those of you preparing for the NMLS SAFE exam, you know underwriting isn't just about crunching numbers. It's the formal assessment of risk. It determines if a loan is good for the borrower, sure, but also if it's good for the lender.
And for the investors. That part's key.
Right. So our mission today is to move past the simple checklist and really understand the underwriting framework. We're talking legal responsibility, professional judgment, verification rules.
And the compliance requirements that are, the absolute core of what the SAFE exam tests.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to frame this whole conversation around that essential tension in lending. The mortgage loan originator is the borrower's advocate, but the underwriter, well, they have to be the ultimate impartial gatekeeper. And as we jump into all this, just a quick note, if you are enjoying these NMLS SAFE study deep dives, please subscribe, like, and comment. You can tell us which topic you want us to cover next, or even which state you are tuned in from. It really supports and helps grow the channel and allows us to reach more learners.
What's fascinating to me right from the start is the concept of authority.
Okay.
If you remember that tension you mentioned, advocate versus gatekeeper, the exam makes it crystal clear who holds the final power. That authority rests solely with the underwriter.
Solely. Not the MLO, not the processor.
Nope. They operate within lender and investor guidelines, and at the end of the day, they carry the burden of that final decision.
That distinction is just massive for testing purposes, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because it just eliminates a whole category of those tempting wrong answers.
It does. Think about it. Any scenario the exam gives you where the final loan approval authority, not document prep, not processing, but the definitive yes or no, is given to an MLO or a processor.
It's wrong.
It's inherently wrong. That responsibility is intentionally put on the underwriter to maintain impartiality and, frankly, to reduce the lender's risk.
Okay, so let's unpack the file. The underwriter has it on their desk. They have the authority. What are they fundamentally looking for? The sources pointed us toward three foundational pillars.
Yeah, we call them the core principles, and they apply to pretty much every loan type. Every single decision boils down to evaluating the borrower's ability and their willingness to repay. And then, right alongside that, is the adequacy of the collateral.
The property itself.
The property itself. If any one of those three pillars is shaky, the whole structure is unsound.
I think that distinction between ability and willingness is a great example of where the exam forces you to think conceptually, not just, mathematically.
Precisely. Think of it this way. Ability to repay is quantitative. It's about the here and now. It's their income, its stability, their current debts. Can they literally afford this payment?
Okay, so that's the math.
That's the math. Willingness to repay, that's the historical piece. It's all about their credit report, their payment behavior, their track record. It answers the question, based on how they've acted in the past, will they actually pay, even if they can't afford it?
And that third pillar, the collateral, that's the safety net.
That's the safety net, yeah. Collateral adequacy asks, is the property worth the risk? If the borrower defaults, can the lender get their money back by selling the house?
So it's about the appraisal, the condition.
The appraised value, the condition, and its marketability, exactly.
And linking all three of those principles together is, well, it's the regulatory cornerstone, especially after 2008, verification.
Yes.
Our source material just stressed this over and over. Underwriting decisions must be based on verified information.
Not stated, not assumed. This is a direct regulatory mandate. So when you see an exam question that talks about stated income or using an applicant's verbal confirmation of their assets,
That's a red flag.
it should immediately be a huge red flag.
Yeah.
Income, assets, debts, all of it has to be documented and verified with third-party sources. We're talking tax returns, pay stubs, bank statements. An underwriter who relies on unverified statements is putting that entire loan file at risk.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, where we move into the nuance of the evaluation.
Yeah.
Income stability.
Mm-hmm.
I think the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people is just, well, a bigger salary equals a better borrower.
Right. More money, less risk.
But the sources highlight that underwriters evaluate not just the amount of income, but its stability, continuity, and likelihood of continuation.
And that's the subtlety that separates good risk assessment from bad. Let's take two borrowers. One makes a massive salary but changes jobs every single year, always chasing a bigger paycheck. The other earns a modest, stable salary and has been with the same company for 15 years. Who do you think the underwriter sees as the safer bet?
Logically, the one with 15 years of consistency. But here's a question. Isn't there a risk that by prioritizing stability so heavily, the guidelines might overlook someone who's highly competent, well-educated, and just changed jobs for a massive, totally justifiable promotion?
That's a great question, and it shows why underwriting requires judgment, not just a calculator. The guidelines often address that. They'll require, say, a minimum time on the new job, maybe 30 days of pay stubs, and a 2-year employment history, even if it's with different employers.
I see.
So they aren't trying to punish growth, they're trying to weed out volatility. If that job change is a promotion in the same field, that's usually fine, but if it's a completely new career path, the scrutiny goes way up. The consistency of their employment history is what's key.
And that consistency feeds right into the math part of the risk.
Yeah.
Debt-to-income ratios, DTI.
Right. DTI is what tells us if the new payment will strain the borrower's finances. We look at two numbers. The front-end ratio is just the new housing payment versus their gross monthly income.
Pretty straightforward.
It is. But the one the underwriter really cares about is the back-end ratio. That combines the new housing payment with all their other required monthly debts, car payments, credit cards, student loans, and compares that total against their income.
And while the specific DTI thresholds can vary by loan program, the exam tests of the rule around them, right?
Absolutely. The critical rule is that the underwriter has to apply the maximum ratio allowed by that program's guidelines. They can't just decide to stretch it because the MLO is pushing them. If the total debt is over the line, it's a problem that has to be solved.
So while DTI is the quantitative risk, credit evaluation is the qualitative part,
Yeah,
the willingness to pay.
exactly. And you mentioned earlier that the focus is on patterns, not isolated events. That's correct, and it's a common area for test traps. A single 30-day late from 3 years ago. That's much less concerning than, say, repeated 60 or 90-day lates in the last 6 months. And the underwriter is also trained to assess recovery. If a borrower had a bankruptcy 5 years ago, the underwriter isn't there to punish them. They're there to see if they've successfully reestablished a positive payment pattern since then.
So we've looked at the borrower's finances, their history. But that's only half the equation, isn't it? That the history is only valuable if the asset they're buying is worth the risk. How does the underwriter transition from the person to the property?
The whole thing pivots on the appraisal, and this is where we hit one of the biggest ethical and compliance rules there is, appraisal independence.
Okay.
The underwriter relies on that appraisal, but they absolutely cannot influence the valuation. The SAFE exam enforces a rigid separation here because the integrity of that valuation protects the entire system.
And the immediate compliance violation, the scenario that the exam just loves to test, is any form of pressure.
Any form, any scenario where an MLO or even the underwriter tries to coerce an appraiser to hit a specific value, maybe by threatening to withhold future business, that is a clear, major violation. It's the ultimate ethical trap.
So if we connect all this, the independence, the verification, it all seems to funnel into one massive consumer protection mandate that came out of the crisis.
Yeah.
The ability to pay, or ATR rule.
The ATR rule is the regulatory backbone of modern underwriting. It's huge. It basically says underwriters have to make a reasonable and good faith determination that the borrower can actually afford to repay the loan.
It's a due diligence requirement.
It is. It shifted the whole focus. It's no longer enough that the borrower signed the papers. The lender now has to prove they verified the borrower could pay.
I see.
And that means if a loan gets approved without properly documenting income, assets, employment, DTI, all the ATR factors, it's a violation. It doesn't matter how badly the borrower wanted the house. Consumer protection overrides sales every single time.
But underwriting isn't always black and white, right? Sometimes a borrower is just slightly outside the lines. Maybe their DTI is a tiny bit high, but they have other big financial strengths. That's where compensating factors come in, I assume.
Exactly. Compensating factors are the nuances that can get a marginal file approved. They're documented strengths that lower the overall risk. A great example is a borrower whose DTI is a point or two over the limit, but they have, say, 12 months of mortgage payments sitting in a savings account.
That's a huge cushion.
It's a huge compensating factor. Another one might be a very low loan-to-value or LTV ratio.
So what's the boundary here for the exam? When does using a compensating factor become an illegal shortcut?
That's the key distinction. Compensating factors do not replace guidelines. They are applied within structured, written rules, and they have to be documented. An underwriter can't just arbitrarily use one to overlook, say, a recent foreclosure or totally unverified income. They still have to follow the program's standards.
Which brings us back to that MLO versus underwriter tension. The underwriter has to maintain this uh, fortress of objectivity.
Absolutely. The decision must be independent. They cannot be influenced by the MLO, the real estate agent, anyone. The ethical mandate is clear: objectivity and documentation. If an exam scenario involves pressure to approve a loan for commissions or personal relationships, the correct answer is always the one that preserves the underwriter's independence.
Okay, let's zoom in on the process itself. Once a file is under review, it's pretty rare that everything's perfect on the first pass. This leads to issuing conditions.
Right, and conditions are a major exam concept. They're often misunderstood by new students.
People mistake them for an approval sometimes.
That's the common mistake. Conditions are explicitly not approvals or denials. They're just requests for more information or clarification because the underwriter found something missing or inconsistent. A condition might be, we need the full 2023 tax transcript, or we need an updated bank statement before closing.
The crucial point being,
They must be cleared. The SAFE exam will test if you know that bypassing a condition, approving a loan without getting that document, is a serious compliance violation because, again, you'd be relying on unverified information, and that violates the ATR rule.
and what if the borrower's situation materially changes during this whole review process?
Yeah.
Like they get laid off or they go out and finance a brand new boat.
That's the concept of material changes. If anything significant changes with their job, income, credit, or assets after they've applied, the file can't just proceed. The only correct response is a full reevaluation based on the new facts. Failing to do that is a huge failure of due diligence.
We'll have to talk about technology because the automated underwriting systems, the AUS, are everywhere now.
They are. Systems like Fannie Mae's Desktop Underwriter or Freddie Mac's Loan Prospector, they give recommendations. Approve eligible, refer, something like that.
But that's the key word, isn't it? Recommendation.
It is. Here's the punchline for the exam. The system does not issue the final approval. An underwriter is still required to review everything. They remain legally and professionally responsible for the final decision. The computer doesn't remove human accountability.
So after this whole rigorous process, verification, judgment, compliance checks,
Yeah.
we get to the end. What are the formal outcomes?
There are three possibilities: approval, conditional approval, or denial. And they all carry regulatory weight. The moment a denial is issued, for example, it triggers adverse action notice requirements. You have to tell the borrower in writing why they were denied. And the final approval, of course, has to be based on that complete verified information that clears the way for closing.
So to summarize our deep dive, underwriting is fundamentally about consistency, objectivity, and verifiable documentation. Discretion without documentation isn't judgment, it's a liability. And the exam consistently rewards answers that pick caution, verification, and compliance with the ATR rule over, speed or some emotionally appealing story.
You absolutely have to train yourself to filter out those emotional distractions the exam throws at you. The deserving single mother, the urgent closing date, the MLO begging for an exception. You have to ignore all that and focus purely on the written guidelines. That's the regulatory mindset.
So we want to leave you with a strategic tool for breaking down any underwriting scenario you see on the SAFE exam. Just run every decision through 4 key questions.
Question 1. Is the information verified by third-party documentation? Question 2. Are written guidelines being followed, or is someone making an arbitrary exception? Question 3. Is the decision independent and objective, free of any outside pressure?
And the last one.
And finally, question 4, does the outcome protect both the borrower and the lender by establishing a reasonable ability to repay? If the scenario fails even one of those 4 tests, you know you're looking at the wrong answer.
And if you are enjoying these NMLS Safe Study Deep Dives, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Tell us which topic you want us to cover next, or tell us which state you are tuned in from. It really supports and helps grow the channel and lets us reach more learners like you.
So we've established that underwriting is where the loan truly lives or dies. It's the ultimate risk control function. And now that we understand how crucial human judgment still is, even with AUS, here's something to think about. As loan processes become, say, 90 or 95% automated, what new forms of regulatory scrutiny might pop up? The regulators will always look for that human sign-off, for the accountability that comes with it, even if a system did most of the work. That continuing human element of judgment, that's the part you need to keep mulling over.
Until next time, keep digging deep.